We are recording. All right. So we had three inquiries on the table for the Huey P. Newton reader. The article titled "In Defense of Self-Defense," Part 1 and Part 2. First inquiry is, what is the thesis? How or what is the method in his thesis and how is it delivered? The second one being, what is this distinction between violence and self-defense? And can African people engage in acts of violence against the state? So when I say the state, I'm just talking about like the government, the powers that be, if you will, right? And then what stood out to you most about the reading? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
Me and Cole kind of discussed in ours, and we were talking about could African Americans commit like violence against the state. We were kind of confused on what you meant with that one. So we talked about what had happened at the Capitol building with the Trump supporters.
Okay.
And we were saying, we were kind of bringing up that, for example, like if that had been like African Americans or anything, like I feel like the government would have retaliated a lot worse.
Yeah.
And then so from that, we kind of said that no, we don't feel as if they can do acts of violence against the state, because it's like they'll just be like the government will kind of have like a reason or something to go to like use like extremely lethal forces.
Yeah. So JW, did you guys discuss at all the distinction between violence and self-defense?
I don't think we went into that too much.
Okay. So, and I only asked that to help maybe clarify what I was trying to get to in the question, right? So like one, there's a distinction drawn between what violence is and what self-defense is, or it should be, right? Like you may not see that, but there's definitely, in my opinion, a distinction between violence and self-defense. And then once that distinction has been established, then you can kind of ask the question, well, can Black folks engage in violent acts against the state? I do like the way that you process the question without truly grasping what I was trying to get at. And I think the way that you went with the question is spot on, right? And I think the January 6th events is a great example of the distinctions between who can enact violence against the state and who can't. Did anybody discuss the distinction between violence and self-defense in their breakout room? There was only 2 breakout rooms. So did the other group at all discuss the distinction between violence and self-defense? So for example, Melanie or Ryan, did you guys have that discussion at all?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
So I was saying that like self-defense is like protecting yourself from harm, from someone's like harming you, and then like violence is like causing harm to someone else. And for the second part, which was, wait, what was the second part? Sorry.
Can African people engage in acts of violence based off of your definition, right, against the state?
I'm kind of like, I'm between like half and half, because they could, but like that would cause more like violence. But I feel like they're protecting themselves from like from all like the acts that like racial acts that have been happening. So I feel like I'm like between like both ends, like like in the middle.
Yeah.
Violence and like non-violence, like
Nice.
self.
Okay, that makes sense. Ryan, do you want to add to that anymore?
I think they can, but it's smarter not to.
Okay.
Because like the system is pretty much like against them, like back, So it's like if they do like, engage in violence against the state, like it will just cause more problems in the long run for them, especially what they're aiming for. So it's better to like protest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's keep that in mind, everyone. I want everyone to keep what Ryan just said in mind. It's better to protest. Like tuck that somewhere, because we're going to revisit that. Okay, let's work through this problematic this way. Okay, let's take a historical contextualization to the experiences of African people. Right, so let's like look at his history and allow history to inform our analysis. So do y'all know like there's like there is rules of engagement when it pertains to war. Have you heard of this before? Like there's certain like criteria and like almost rules, right? That go into play when we're talking about war. Part of the rules of engagement, right? Kidnapping is something that could insinuate a war. That's something that would violate a social contract that will allow for something like a war to persist or take place, right? So here's where I'm going with that. When the West, right, when the West decided that they're going to engage in the process of kidnapping African people and transplanting them to the Americas for unpaid labor, I would argue that's an act that is insinuating a war, right? One could even go further back and say that when the Arabs, the Asians, and the Europeans forcefully invaded and conquered Africa, that's an act of war, right? So what I'm trying to get you to understand is there's been a historic battle that has been taking place between a certain group of people and another group of people, right? That predates what we call the United States, right? In fact, the byproduct and the aftermath of that war built the United States through unpaid labor, okay? So if we're talking about violence and we're talking about self-defense and drawing a distinction between the two, the first act of violence was either the invasion, right? Or the kidnapping of the African people to have them come here to work for free, right? That's the first act of violation that would allow for a war to take place, right? So now if we're taking this into a historical reference, and we know who levied the first blow into this historical epic of a war that I'm trying to articulate, I asked the question again. One, what's the distinction between violence and self-defense? Melanie said, self-defense is to protect yourself against violence, right? And violence, according to Melanie, is to insinuate, is to start the altercation, right? And that's how she distinguishes the two. So if historically, the instigator of this historic battle has been non-African people, then I ask the question, can African people engage in acts of violence, right, against the state apparatus that we call the West? Do you understand the line of questioning now, right? So really what the question is, what I'm trying to get you to think about is when African people try to engage in acts of resistance, I'll call it that, right? It cannot be violent because they're always acts of self-defense. You understand what I'm saying? Historically, we have not levied the first blow. So because of that fact, African people are always in the space of responding from a level of self-defense. Anybody, this is kind of old and this may be beyond your time capacity, but does anybody remember Christopher Dorner? Christopher Dorner? No? 1 second.
Oh yeah, he was the cop that killed
Yep.
other cops.
Yep.
I remember that.
Even Christopher Dorner, so here's a picture of him to help maybe jog your memory. And I think this is also kind of serendipitous in the sense that, right, look at the image that you see here, right? So he's a war veteran, and then he goes on to become a police officer. Cole, if you can you kind of give us a quick synopsis of what Christopher Dorner did? I think it would be more accurate.
I don't remember a lot about it. I just remember he shot a bunch of other cops.
Yeah.
It's LAPD.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, other than that, I don't remember too much about it.
Cool. So yeah, just like Cole said, right? Christopher Dorner is a former, I think, military veteran. He goes into the police force, right? And then I want to say at least a week. It may have been 2 weeks. I could be a little off on that, but over a 2-week period, we'll say, he engaged in maybe 6 murders of LAPD officers, even some of their relatives or loved ones, right? But before he goes on this rampage, he writes a manifesto. And in his manifesto, he articulates his rationale as to why he's doing what he's doing. Now, also kind of keep a temporal contextualization, keep time in mind. This predates like the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter wasn't a thing during Christopher Dorner, right? But in his manifesto, he's articulating a lot of the grievances that Black Lives Matter and those who organize around this claim articulate, right? Police corruption, disproportionate punishment of Black bodies, the murder of Black bodies, when what they call the blue wall of silence, right? So if something does go on behind the scenes or something's done that is corrupt or unacceptable, all police officers must remain quiet and be complicit in that act, right? So he talks about all these things, and he talks about the racism that he personally experienced within the department and the attacks that he personally experiences within the department. And this is why he's doing what he's doing, right? And I bring him up because if you begin to research Christopher Dorner, he's going to be depicted as hyper-violent, right? In fact, when he was captured up in Lake Arrowhead, over 20 squad cars, a bomb squad, they actually set off a bomb in the house that they found him in, right? And this was all because of the violence that the state apparatus has placed on the person of Christopher Dorner, right? But I would argue, if you are to take this historical epic into context, Christopher Dorner was acting in self-defense against a state apparatus that has historically been violent to African people. And this is where I want to kind of get you all to think about the distinction between self-defense and violence. And think about that as you get into the reading for this week, the Huey P. Newton reader, In Defense of Self-Defense, Part 1 and Part 2. So Huey P. Newton, Dr. Huey P. Newton, he received his Ph.D. from the University of Santa Cruz up north. I want to say it was a doctor in philosophy. I could be off on that. But his dissertation is brilliant. It's a fabulous piece of writing. So one, a lot of people don't give him credit for his PhD. Also, he is the founder of the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense out of Oakland. We learned a little bit about him last week through the readings on Kwame Ture. But brilliant activist, brilliant organizer. He understood the power of an aesthetic, right? Like the look of the Black Panther was the epitome of cool, right? The black beret, the black leather. So he understood the importance of aesthetic, very similar to Marcus Garvey. He also understood the importance of media manipulation, right? One of the things that the Black Panthers did was they were always in the newspaper, in the news. They always had a media presence, and that attributed to their global mass movement that was built. So San Francisco City College up in the Bay is where Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party. He was probably either younger or around y'all age, right? I want to say he was 19 when he formulated the Black Panther Party. And that's an interesting meditation within itself. Not getting in the habit of thinking I have to be an adult or I have to be in my 30s or 40s to be able to create change. More times than not, the advocates of change are the youth and the younger people in society and the people your age, right? So let's get into the notes. And he starts off with a very interesting ethical claim. Men were not created to obey laws. Laws were created to serve men, right? So he's taking an abstract analysis or an interpretation on the work that a law should do, right? And he's kind of making the law almost an actionable person or figure within itself as he thinks about it, because he's saying that, you know, laws don't dictate how men should move, right? Men write laws to dictate how society should operate, right? But then he also says there is no disagreement about this function of law in any circle, excuse me. The disagreement arises from the question of which men laws are to serve, right? So who are the men that the laws will abide to, right? Such lawmakers ignore the fact that it is the duty of the poor and unrepresented to construct rules and laws that serve their interests better, right? So what Huey is claiming, what Dr. Newton is claiming, is that there's a duty, there's an ethical responsibility of the poor and the underprivileged to write their own laws to serve in their own interests. Does anybody know how laws get placed on the books? Does anybody know the process for that? How to move legislation through the legislator to be placed on the books to be a law? Anyone familiar? Okay, Ryan, I hope everything is good, man. Good luck with that. Anyone familiar with the structure of lobbying? Have anybody heard of this term, lobbying? So
No.
No? Okay. So lobbying is how laws get placed on the book. So when I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA, I was able to be an intern for the California Faculty Association. And it's like the union for the faculty at Cal State, right? And what I was able to do as the intern is go up to Sacramento, the state capital, and try to get a law passed, which ended up being the law that recently got passed 2 years ago about ethnic studies being a requirement, right? And what happens when we go up to do that, and I asked the lady, like, yo, so how do certain laws get pushed through and certain laws don't? Like, what's the difference, right? And she tells me, right, everyone does just like y'all do. They'll come up to the state capitol and they'll try to advocate for their laws to be passed by lawmakers, right? And unfortunately, groups like yourself, they come, but they come empty-handed, right? The groups that have other laws that seek to be passed that aren't so socially responsible, if you get my drift, when they come to lobby, they come with little yellow envelopes with thousands upon thousands of dollars in them, right? So not only is it the signatures that need to be accumulated to go on to this bill to make it the bill a law, right? Not only is it the process of going through the footwork of going up to the state capitol and talking to the representatives to get this law on the books, but it's money, right? You have to pay money to get the ear of these legislators for them to place your law on the books. Now, think about what Huey just said, right? It's the responsibility of the poor and the underrepresented to create laws for themselves to service their needs. But in a capitalistic system like we operate within, there's things that, like lobbying, that circumvent the ability of the poor and the underrepresented to create laws for themselves, right? Because if you don't, as the legislator told me when we went to visit, if you're not coming up here with a manila envelope with cash, that law ain't getting passed, right? And then he also uses the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Newton, he uses the Declaration of Independence as an argumentative tool, right? As a way to further support his argument. Because he says, you know, the United States defected from Britain to establish their own society, to break away from that British colony, right? And a form of protection that allowed them to maintain their independence, their sovereignty, and establish their own form of power is the Declaration of Independence. But why is it, my fault, y'all. Why is it when African people try to express their oppression at the hands of the state, that Declaration of Independence doesn't include them? It doesn't include their right to defend themselves, their right to bear arms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then he also makes a very interesting claim. I don't know, actually, I'm curious to hear what you all think about this. He says that it is our belief, the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, that the Black people in America are the only people who can free the world, loosen the yoke of colonialism, and destroy the war machine. Black people who are within the machine can cause it to malfunction. They can, because of their intimacy within the mechanism, destroy the engine that is enslaving the world, right? So he's saying that Black folks are the only people, according to the Black Panther Party. And in this context, he's speaking specifically of Black folks located within America, right? Who y'all may call African Americans, or who I would call Africans in America, are the only people who could stifle, destroy, dismantle this war machine of the West, right? And he says, because we're one located within this war machine, and there's an intimacy that we have with the war machine that will allow us to dismantle it, right? So I'm curious, what do y'all think about the claim of, one, Black folks being the only people who could do it? Because to me, that's a very large responsibility to place just on Black folks, right? And then it also strips the power from underrepresented white folks, from minoritized indigenous folks, right? From marginalized Asian folks, right? So it takes the responsibility off of their hands. So I'm curious, what do you all think about this claim that Black folks are the only people who can dismantle this war machine?
Something I've always thought of from living in the South for a long time is, you know, the South is like the most conservative part of the country, but that's because you go there and they have the worst education, you know, the highest levels of poverty with every, you know, type of person. So I've always thought, like, I definitely think what he's saying is partially true, but like if there was some way that like Southern white people could be changed into being more conscious somehow, I don't know how it's possible. It's so deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
But like their school, the schools there suck, you know, like all the tax laws are regressive, you know, like the pay is terrible. The minimum wage is terrible everywhere in the South. So I don't know. I've always thought that was something that's like, if there's some way to like change those people, then the country would be so different.
You're onto something, Cole. Have you are you familiar with Fred Hampton?
I mostly from watching. I watched Judas and the Black Messiah. It was really good, and yeah, he in the movie he finds those, you know, people, and yeah, he. That's why I think that's a big reason why they were like, oh man, this guy can get these like poor white people involved too. Then he's like really onto something.
Yep. And that's what made him so dangerous, because not only did he organize the Black community, he organized the spaces like the Latin Kings and the indigenous community, but he also was very effectively organizing poor whites. And to the state, that was the most dangerous thing that could be done, because to Cole's point, right, if you start to get these poor white folks to see what's going on, the whole situation is flipped. In fact, that was a very foundational move of the power structure, because what they did was, when African people were being shipped over here, and the population of African people, because they were a workforce, started to get larger than the population of white folks, right? A lot of poor white folks were kind of getting a little insecure about that fact, right? Because they're not getting the wealth of the slave owners, right? They're not getting the jobs because the jobs are going to the free labor source, right? So they were kind of isolated. And what this power structure did was they incentivized the idea of whiteness, right? So you don't have money, you don't have capital, you don't have land, but what you do have is the social capital of whiteness, right? So you will never be as bad as them because of you don't have their complexion, right? And that to me is the impediment of what Cole is attentive to, right? It's this idea that my whiteness is a social capital that keeps me separate from Black folks. And that they don't want to give that up to allow a just society to be manifest. And that's why I always like to distinguish the difference between the idea of whiteness and those who occupy white bodies, because they're not mutually exclusive. There's a separation, right? For those who are poor and occupy white bodies, they're a line of separation from this idea of whiteness, right? So you bring up a very good point, Cole. He also makes the claim that the oppressed should negate anything that the oppressor supports, right? And the oppressed should support anything that the oppressor negates. Kind of like what Malcolm said last week, right? Anything that the man is against, we should be for. Anything that the man is for, we should be against, right? He also makes the claim, and this is why I'm so attentive to not using terms like minority. He says the slave has always outnumbered the slave master, and this is true today. The so-called minority has always outnumbered the so-called majority, right? Moving into the part two of the speech, I don't have a lot for part two. This idea that African people within the Americas are colonized entities, this is something that really reverberates within the 60s, the late 60s, going into the 70s Black Power movement. And this is something that a lot of the disciples of Malcolm X pick up. So Malcolm, if you notice, he talks about second-class citizenship. Black folks aren't American, they occupy the second-class citizenship status, which is equal to colonization or equal to being colonized. The Black Panther Party and those who came after Malcolm really took up this idea of African people being colonized, African people in America being colonized. This is also important because it adds to the global discourse that's going on outside of the United States. Because think about, we're in the 1960s, right? And in Africa, in the late 50s, African nations are getting free. They're overthrowing colonialism, right? Ghana got their independence. Nigeria would soon later get its independence. Guinea would get its independence, right? So Africans in America are watching what's going on in Africa, so they figure it's wise to tie their struggle here to the struggles going on the continent, because it makes it a global struggle, right? So if y'all are fighting colonization there on the continent of Africa, we're also fighting our own version of colonization here in the United States. Let's see what else I got. And then, okay, so to go back to, I believe it was Melanie, and it may have been Ryan, I'm not sure, but they said that it's better to protest, right? And I said, keep that in the back of your mind. I want to read this part. One second, y'all. Okay. I'm looking at the second page of the speech, 139, the first paragraph. It says, this view holds that Black people constitute a hopeless minority and that salvation for Black people lies in developing brotherly relations. There are certain tactics that are taboo. Violence against the oppressor must be avoided at all costs, because the oppressor will retaliate with superior force. Sorry, with superior violence. They will retaliate with superior violence. There's a lot of what you all said earlier during the breakout rooms, right? So it says, so Black people may protest, but not protect. They can complain, but not cut and shoot. In short, Black people must at all costs remain nonviolent, right? On the other side, we find that the point of departure is the principle that the oppressor has no rights that the oppressed is bound to respect. Kill the slave master, destroy him utterly, move against him with implacable fortitude, break his oppressive power by any means necessary. Men who have stood before the Black masses and recommended this response to the oppressor have been held in fear by the oppressor. So what is going on here? There's two opposing discourses at play within this passage that I read by Huey, right? So he said that there's the American, he calls it the particular position where in order to gain acceptance into mainstream Americanism, then you cannot engage in active violence, right? You could protest, but not cut or shoot, right? You can't protect yourself. So there's a sort of way that you have to go about advocating for your freedom to be included into mainstream Americanism, right? But he said there's another side though. And there's another side that says that we are able and we are bound by natural law to use any means necessary, and you know who that comes from, right? Because we know that Huey is a disciple of Malcolm, to break the oppressor's power, right? Any means necessary. Nothing is off the table. So if that means cutting, shooting, if that means retaliation and self-defense, then that's what we'll do to get the oppressor off of us, right? But he says, but these men who have stood before the Black masses and recommended this response have always been held in fear by the oppressor, right? So these people, the Malcolm X's of the world, the Huey P. Newtons of the world, have been depicted in such a way that the Black masses should be afraid of their message. We should illegitimate their message, right? Because that is not aligned with the mainstream American vision of how you advocate for your freedom, right? And then they, I'll end it there just for sake of time. Yeah, I'll end it with that, right? But he does end the speech letting it be known that we are in fact disciples of Malcolm, right? And he just kind of puts that out there. I want to say the majority of y'all have done your 2 fish bowls. I know Cole's good. Melanie, do you know if you've done 2 fish bowls already?
I think so. Yes.
I
Yeah.
want to say you have 2. I mean, I believe Jaime, you've done 2 also. Matthew, how about you? Have you done 2? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. All right. Lee, I believe you've done 2 also. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I've done both.
Yeah, okay. So I'm looking right now, Matthew, to see if I can locate 2. I have 2 separate folders with the notes for fish bowls. So I might be short on one. Give me 1 second. But what may be a good idea, Matthew, if you're uncertain, just to do another one, and then that way you know for sure that you're covered. Yeah, like I said, man, I have 2 folders. I don't see you on this one. That doesn't mean that you haven't gone. I just don't have, I'm not gonna take the time to look at the second one. But if you want, you're the only one that has not done 2 fish bowls online today. Did you want to try to get one in, or how you feeling?
Yeah, I could read something from my journal.
And then since it's just you, man, you could talk about the notes. You could talk about what we just talked, what I just discussed. You could talk about your breakout room, whatever's on the table. Just your thoughts about the subject matter for today. And you can start when you're ready.
Yeah, so like what I got was that he said America created he said an imperialistic war machine.
Mhm.
And its like purpose is to like, I guess like, well, he said enslave the world, but like for me it's just to like show how powerful they are and this and that. And like what keeps that going, it was the enslavement of African people who live in America now.
Yeah.
Like even if they came straight from Africa or their descendants from like African blood.
Yeah.
And another thing is that like the only people who are capable of destroying the machine are all like the African people themselves, because they're so familiar with it. Like throughout their whole time being here, they always had to deal with like brutality and like other things like that. Like it just hasn't been fair for them since the start.
problem with them destroying this machine is that they're not treated fairly. And like what we talked about in the breakout room was, I think it was JW or Cole that brought up about when they rioted the Capitol, how like it's not fair for like the white people who rioted the Capitol and nothing happened to them.
You're kind of breaking up, Matthew. Like you're going in and out. I don't know if you're like moving away from the microphone, but I can't hear you right now.
Does it sound clear now, or is it still breaking up?
It's still a little faint.
I mean, I'm close to my microphone.
Yeah, you might have a bad connection there, man. But I'll say I think I got the gist of what you're saying, and I'll take that. You'll get credit for your fishbowl. I wrote that down, so thank you for that. I could also tell that you engaged the material fairly well. But I'm going to pose this question to the class as a whole, because really another thing of this idea of dismantling the war machine, right? Another way of saying that is revolution, right? And does everyone know, if I say revolution, do you understand what I mean by that when I say revolution? So part of a revolution, right, is to destroy, right? This is idea of destroying and rebuilding, right? So you're going to destroy all that is to reestablish a new society. And my question to you all is are we at a point in our society where we need a revolution, right? Does the fabric of this society, the foundations of this society, the pillars of this society, are they so corrupt that they need to be removed, dismantled, done away with, so that a new just society can be built? What do y'all think? Do you think it's necessary, or do you think that's just too much to ask?
I mean, if I can say something, like, I think it's pretty obvious, especially to young people, that at least this country is not going to get better on its own. But in light of climate change and everything, like, I don't know if anyone else thinks this, but I really don't know if any meaningful change is gonna happen in time. I think it would happen, but I'm starting to wonder if it will happen in time.
Yeah. So if I could paraphrase what Lee's saying, right? Like, we're on a short clock, like, because the way, if you even just take just climate change, because the way that this country, this society treats the planet, right? It has placed a time span or a time limit on our ability to course correct. And we may not have the luxury of time to get this right because we've already fucked up the planet. I have to say I agree. Cole says he 1,000% feels that we have to completely eradicate this structure to rebuild another one. Do you want to elaborate on that, Cole? You don't have to if you don't want to, it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the people that have destroyed the planet should be held accountable to the fullest extent. They're destroyed the planet, then, what do you do to somebody that wipes out millions of people's lives, and like, there's only one answer in my mind. So, and I mean, like, even if the planet does end, there's still going to be something left, and we need to be able to have, there's going to be some sort of society after we're all, most of the people are gone. I don't know how to think about that, but I mean, it's like with the amount that the wealth gap is such a big part of it too.
Yep. Yeah, that right there, that's the issue, Cole. Because I'm thinking, like, and y'all probably ain't thinking about buying homes and things like that now just because of your age. But like, so I'm about to be 40, so I'm thinking about buying a new home, moving to a nicer part of town or what have you, right? And the fucking housing market is ridiculous right now. like ridiculous. I don't see how anyone can afford a home. And if you're paying for the home, you're paying well above the market price or the market value for the home, right? So you can't buy homes because of some chip, right? The cost of cars are fucking ridiculous, right? So the economy is fucked right now, right? And to Cole's point, the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to struggle. Elon Musk just bought Twitter for, what was it, $44 billion. $44 billion, right? So you know he didn't go broke buying that. You know what I'm saying? So he still got some money in the bank, right? So this is just the distinguishing and the separation and the bifurcation between the super rich and the poor. $44 billion. Melanie, I seen you had some comments in the chat. Do you want to kind of articulate your thoughts on, do we need to completely revolutionize our society, or can we reform our society?
I believe that there should be like a revolution because of like how like those incidents, like the George Floyd incident, and how the immigration, like how people from a lot of countries of like South America, like even farther away, are like coming over here to the U.S., such as like Ukraine, like how even some refugees are coming over here because of how the war is over there. And I believe like all that's causing, some like, racism here, and how people are getting treated like not properly. So I feel like there should be a revolution to like stop like racism. Well, yeah.
All the isms, right? Like all the racism, classism, sexism. Yeah, I agree. And Melanie, you bring something up for me that I didn't think about till now, right? And was it 2 years ago they had over 200 migrants at the borders detained in camps, right? But where were they migrating from?
I forgot. Somewhere from Colombia, and then somewhere from I forgot.
So mostly brown areas, right? Like indigenous areas, Colombia, Mexico, South America is where these people were migrating from, and they got detained at the borders of the United States. I forgot the figure, but Biden just signed another hundreds of $billions for Ukrainian refugees. He's accepting a certain amount of Ukrainian refugees to come to the States. I forget which HBCU, which historically Black college, decided to give Ukrainians free tuition to attend their colleges, right? And I'm looking at that and I'm like, yo, so in one breath, we're going to detain over 200 brown folks from coming into the country. But in the same breath, we're going to invite all of these Ukrainians, refugees, to come into the country. What's the difference? Why is one accepted and one is not, right? And again, the idea of whiteness. Another thing, another statistic to think about as it pertains to that, right? They say by 2045, the US Census dictates that, or predicts that the look of the country will flip. So the country will numerically be more people of culture than there will be white folks, right? So if that is the case, how can you circumvent that from taking place? Let a lot of Ukrainians in, because what's that going to do? Increase the white population, right? So it helps to starve off the inevitable of them not being the so-called majority, right? And yes, Jaime, money is always involved in a capitalistic society. All right. Does anyone else have any comments, questions, or concerns? It sounds like you all are advocating for revolution, which I'd agree with. I think that's the only chance we got left. But also, don't idealize that word. A lot of hard work, bloodshed, pain, struggle, uncomfortability that goes into enacting what we all feel is necessary. And I think that it has not happened because it requires a lot of sacrifice. It requires a lot of loss. It requires a lot of uncomfort, right? And we're not willing to give that up to make our situation better. And that's also a problem. Let me point out our reading for next week. Can you say that out loud, Melanie?
Because we were talking about like different groups, and I was like, in the news, we were talking about how Haitians too were like coming to the border, seeking like aid from like corruption, like countries with a lot of corruption, and like yeah.
Yep, it's true. And they sent their ass right back to Haiti. They was not fucking with them. So for next week, we'll read this James Baldwin here, A Letter from the Region of the Mind. This is the second essay in the book Fire Next Time. For those who had me before, we read the first essay in the book Fire Next Time. This will be the second essay. So please read that. I will try to remember to email that out. I know I forgot this week, but I always like to point this out to you here. So that way, if I do forget, you know where to find the reading, okay? Let me just kind of pull it up to see how long it is. Yeah, it's a little bit lengthier. So it says 58 pages, but look at the page, right? It's not very heavy. So you'll be able to get through it. It's a page turner. Baldwin is very clear. He's very easy to understand, but he writes beautifully. Like, it's beautifully well written. So kind of give yourself some time, get through as much of it as you can. I know it's a lot, but I think if you can get through it, you'll appreciate it, and then kind of read it with keeping all that we've been discussing in mind, because what it really is a conversation about is all that we've covered in the past 3 weeks. He's comparing the civil rights struggle to the Black Power struggle, and where will Black folks go moving forward because of those two movements. So if you can get through it, it'll be worth it, but get through as much as you can. Any other last minute questions, comments, or concerns? All right, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your week. Be healthy, be wealthy, be wise. Get your exercise, water, and vitamin D. I will see you next Monday. Peace. All right, cool. All right, Jaime. Have a good one, man.